Next on Rugby Wrap-Up, George Hook, Steve Lewis, and Matt McCarthy on the Autumn Nations Cup, Fiji's COVID crisis, and Los Pumas. Rugby Wrap-Up brought to you in part by The Pig and Whistle, the world's best rugby pub. The Murphy Kennedy Group, founded with the idea that construction can be done better. And Lean and Limber, stretching your way to a healthier lifestyle. Hey everybody, welcome back to Rugby Wrap-Up. Matt McCarthy in Midtown Manhattan. Good to have you back. And I am joined by two juggernauts of the global rugby landscape. In Manhattan, Mr. Stephen Lewis on the Upper West Side. He is tanned from his trip to Mexico. He's not going to tell us any stories. And from across the pond in Ireland, in Dublin, Mr. George Hook, who often at this time of year would be in Portugal. George, I'll welcome you first. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's great to be back on the premier rugby television show, not just in North America, but possibly in the whole Northern Hemisphere.
Thank you. Thank you. I will not disagree with you at all. And Stephen, welcome to you.
Good afternoon. How you doing?
So, guys, we have a little bit of rugby going on, despite the fact that the pandemic is shutting down certain organizations like Fiji, which earlier this week had 29 cases of the COVID reported, and after they lost in a 28-0 official score to France, their match against Italy has now been suspended. Is that right, Stephen?
That is correct. Yep. I don't know what's going on there with their management. It's like a reverse bubble, how you can get that many positive tests. But unfortunately, they missed a game against France. The game against Italy has now been cancelled, and I pretty much think their participation in this tournament is unfortunately done for.
Is that the fault of World Rugby? Is it the fault of the Six Nations or the Eight Nations setup? Is it the fault of the Fiji staff, or is it all of the above?
There's a danger here. I may go on forever, but I'll try and be quick. The problem is not with rugby. The problem is actually with the pandemic itself and how governments and health authorities are dealing with it. So, like the Irish soccer team loses two of its players because they sat in the wrong seats on the aeroplane. The whole testing procedure is in doubt. I'm with Steve. I simply do not know how you can get 29 guys in a squad to test positive. I mean, clearly, there's only one way you can do that, and that is to have zero discipline, and that's the only way it can happen. There is no other, to the best of my knowledge, case, certainly in international rugby, but probably in international team sport, where you have that kind of level. It's about discipline. It's where have they been? We've seen it with some of the British players, the English players, I should say, and various other things, where you just have no discipline.
Yeah, we just had a report of tight heads dropping in Super Rugby down in Australia, the Super Rugby Unlocked, putting that in jeopardy as well. But we did have some rugby played, and we had Friday Night Lights kicking us off in the Eight Nations or the Autumn Nations Cup, George. And I know that you were upset that CJ Standard didn't play, but you were tickled pink to see Quinn Roux and James Lowe, with Lowe getting his first try in his first test match for Ireland.
Yes, and of course, Gibson Park. I mean, the Irish Tourist Board with all these holiday makers who come over now and we give them passports to an Irish shirt. I am very unhappy about it. So let's take a pass on that. Instead of which, look at Ireland. The position now, Ireland sit proudly at the top of the third division. There is no second division, and England and France are in the first division. Let's look at Ireland, because that's what you want to hear about. Scrummage, very, very good. Back row, outstanding. Line-out, pretty good. Forwards in general, reasonable. And then you hit a minefield. The first choice halfbacks are beyond their sell-by date. The captaincy is appalling. The back play is juvenile. And if any coach worthy of the name who picks the worst defender in the whole of the island to play at full back certainly needs to be asked the question. So Ireland are dreadful. They are only less dreadful than Wales. Wales would have been beaten by the Loreto Convent under 17s.
I was grateful, Stephen, that you didn't have to suffer through that match with me at 2 p.m. And the only consolation is I was at the Pig and Whistle. But, 2 p.m. here in New York, because it was Friday Night Lights over there. But that was just an awful match to watch. And, if I'm Ireland, I'm going to just start blooding players going into these matches, because who cares? It's all right. It was 32-19, but who cares? And Welsh fans are on the internet, and half of them now are waffling whether they let Warren Gatland go too early. And is it Pivac or Pivots? How do you say his last name? How long do you go with him, Steve?
Pivac. He gets another 2-3 games, I would imagine, but 6 in a row for Wales to lose, or any professional team to lose, is, obviously they're under the gun. But what is this tournament anyway? For me, high-level rugby right now is formulaic. You scrum to get a penalty, you kick to the corner, you maul it over, defenses are too organised. Rugby is not entertaining right now, and the Autumn Nations Cup, which is really just dreamed up to replenish the coffers of the home unions. And without fans, there's no pomp and circumstance, there's no intensity. It's not a great tournament, it's not particularly exciting. I really don't know. There's not many positives about it for me. Probably the only one, in fact, is that Scotland are performing reasonably. They're now 5 on the bounce. They've won 5 in a row. Toughed it out against Italy in Florence, of all places, last weekend, without either of their top guns, Finn Russell or Adam Hastings. They had the man with the Scottish afro, Duncan Weir, back at 10.
Yeah, great afro.
A creditable win, a bit more steel in their pack, shall we say. And I have a similar problem to George with all of our South African project players. Duhan van der Merwe is a magnificent athlete, will be a great winger, and he'll be a great asset to a Scotland rugby team, but he's not Scottish.
And George, you have this sprinkling and you have this eligibility question, but everybody's doing it. So unless everybody stops doing it, it's not going to end. So do you embrace the players or do you continue to scoff?
Well, as long as you have Billy Beaumont at the head of World Rugby, nothing's going to change, because Billy Beaumont doesn't do change. Billy Beaumont is probably the most conservative administrator I've met in my entire life. So he's not going to make change. This is going to go on forever, despite the efforts of Pichot of Argentina, who was cruelly treated in the vice presidency stuff, where you have a French guy under investigation by his own police force. You have a convicted felon in Fiji, was the best pal of Billy Beaumont, and so on. So World Rugby is a lot to ask itself. It's not all good. Now, again, Steve is so right. This is a dreadful game. This is an awful game, but it's an awful Northern Hemisphere game. Like, if you look at that Argentinian side, hadn't played a game in over a year, and they beat the All Blacks. And they've got, 5 kids pretty well, they blood. You look at Italy, who did incredibly well against Scotland, didn't get enough credit for it. Kids, they bring 20-year-old fly half, a young prop forwards. So, and then you look at Ireland, which, they select from the local St. Vincent de Paul dollar dinner lunches or whatever. I mean, we're going nowhere. And we are playing, despite the best efforts of not playing the unadulterated crap that Joe Schmidt presented, we now trying to turn, as my mother used to say, a sow's ear into a silk purse, and you can't do it. So this game is not heading in the right direction. It's heading in the right, well, it never went away in the Southern Hemisphere. The game's awful.
Yeah, but you know what? If COVID hadn't interrupted, I was really looking forward to that France-Fiji game. That intrigued me. And that might have been the one saving grace for the whole tournament in terms of, okay, now we see why this is worthwhile. It gives a leg up or a hand down to some of these tier 2 nations, Georgia and Fiji. And that brings us to England versus Georgia, 40 zip. And George, you could talk about Jamie George beating Georgia. Is this a necessary evil, or is it counterproductive for a country like Georgia?
I mean, you know, the only side that Georgia could conceivably replace, is not going to happen in the Six Nations, is Italy. Italy are what, 25 games without a win or something? So Italy shouldn't really be in the Six Nations, but they are. Georgia are not going to be there, so it's absolutely irrelevant. It's no coincidence that Lourdes is in France, because the only miracle that is currently taking place in Northern Hemisphere rugby is the way France played a game under Fabien Galtier. And England will continue to play the kind of, you know, strong arm tactics that they continue to employ. With, interestingly, the wrong fly half, but it's not totally their fault because George Ford isn't available. But Farrell continues. Like, there used to be a fella in fiction called a saint who really was a master cracksman but always got away with the crimes. Well, I mean, Farrell continues to get away with the crime every week and never gets penalised for it. He's a bad captain. He's a bad fly half.
Well, he shouldn't be the captain because of his checkered past and his proclivity for penalties that he gets away with. But I still think he's a great fly half. I'd want him on my team.
Sorry, the word great is spelled Great, and it is rarely used until somebody is great. And I can tell you that Farrell is not great. If Farrell is put up against, and if you want me to start with Jackie Kyle in 1947, I'll work my way through all the Irish fly halves.
We don't have time for that just now.
But he is average.
Bridged version.
He is average.
Okay, so we could disagree on that. Steve, hey, you know, but again,
it's a democracy. Yeah, you know, despite the Democrats being in power, it's a democracy over there.
George Hook, the righty.
To something you said about 5 points ago, tale of two coaches. You look at Purr-fect Wales, right, who's brought in to play a more entertaining brand because they weren't satisfied with Gatland's success rate and his style of rugby, the Welsh-like style. So he has failed. Gregor Townsend, who was promoted from his great Glasgow days, swashbuckling, we're going to play the fastest rugby in the world, has had to recalibrate. Since he's recalibrated back to this efficient, boring style, Scotland have become more successful. So that's a fundamental problem when you have success and entertainment at such odds, which is the modern game. With regard to Farrell, you know where I stand, and great is not a word that would come to mind.
Okay, fair enough. And speaking to Gatland's record with Wales, 52%.
Who do you want to watch? Finn Russell, Richie Mayunga, or Farrell? Who do you want pulling the strings?
Well, how about the world's best fly half that's not playing fly half in Bowden Barrett? No?
Yeah, how many blind alleys do you want to go down, McCarthy? Okay.
Andre Pollard?
You have without a shadow of a doubt on your program tonight two of the finest analysts of rugby union it has ever seen.
I'm just an American. What do I know? Andre Pollard's carrying the cup around in his back pocket, though.
All right. Okay. Like, we won't even discuss. Like, I mean, look, just talk about France for a moment. Look at the halfbacks at France.
Very good.
It's just wonderful to watch them. You look even at Italy with that 20-year-old kid at fly half. You're looking at teams who are attempting to play the game as it was at rugby school 150 years ago when he picked up the ball and in defiance of the rules of the time, he ran with it. Now, what we're looking at is a bastardization of a great game. And the only feature of it is interesting, is it may go bust. Now, if it goes bust, as I think there's a reasonable possibility, then we're
going to hear a large thud in Manhattan if it goes bust.
And then you could have amateur rugby and we could see the real game again.
Huh, all right, we can cover amateur rugby. All right, let's take a quick break, guys, and then we're going to come back and touch upon that match that happened in Australia that had people shaking in their seats. We'll be right back with Mr. George Hook and Mr. Steve Lewis after this. If you're in New York City and want to watch some great rugby, have some great food, and some great times, go to the world's best rugby pub, the Pig and Whistle on West 36th Street. And we are back. Steve Lewis, George Hook, Matt McCarthy. Guys, we left off with a cliffhanger about that match in Australia. I believe it was Parramatta that it was played. New Zealand versus Argentina. Who'd have thunk, Stephen?
Yeah, well, so this is actually a positive rugby story, right? Here's a team through, brute skill, effort, and sheer power of will, won a historic game against the All Blacks. They hadn't played for a year. They're practicing in a garage. They're practicing in a back garden. They came together. They represented their country proudly, and they put one over the All Blacks. That's the best story that's in rugby in the last 3 months. And credit to them.
Pablo Matera, right? Unbelievable.
Your new boyfriend, yep. He certainly covered himself in glory this last weekend as a captain and as a player, for sure.
He's got a good old-fashioned Dan Power man crush on this guy, George. That number 6, you got to love a guy like that on your team.
Yeah, but there was another thing which, we, us Northern Hemisphere people, noticed. There was a crowd at the game.
Exactly.
Like what Australia and New Zealand have done, and we're not going down the pandemic route anymore.
Well, it sounds like we are.
But despite a lot of sensible planning, they've got crowds at games. And you can have all the fake sound you like, but whether it's the Masters golf or whether it's rugby, without a crowd, it is no good. And it's so good to see crowds in the Southern Hemisphere. As for Argentina, Steve said it all. He doesn't need me to say anything. It was just heartwarming. It was just wonderful. And now look at New Zealand. 2 losses in a row. And I suspect there was probably a midnight cabinet meeting. The government may fall. This is serious stuff for them. 2 matches in a row.
Fans were distraught after they lost to Australia. And it was like the end of the world. And they were commenting all over the internet. And those of us were like, you got to be kidding, right? You lose 1 match every 50 weeks.
But there's an undercurrent there, right? And there's been something of a sort of a climate of suspicion about the appointment of Foster as coach. A lot of people were aggrieved that it wasn't given to, Razor Robertson, Flavour of the Month, and it went to Foster. And there's almost been a segment of the New Zealand press and public that have been looking for him to fail. And that's in a country where this happens, where rugby is a passion, right? So it has come to pass. They have, for them, failed by losing 2 consecutive games. The knives are out. That management team is under significant pressure the next time they pull on those black jerseys. And in many respects, it was a subpar performance by players rather than coaching team, in my opinion.
Steve, you mentioned Robertson. George, have you heard any of the whispers over there about Robertson going to Wales?
And no, the pandemic has shut us all down here. So, I haven't been outside the house since St. Patrick's Day to you Irish people. It's the 17th of March. So, we don't hear very much.
What are you getting your news with a glass to the door?
No, but I mean that quite seriously. What has happened with rugby in Ireland? And to be honest, it's happened in the home nations, as we call Ireland, England, Scotland, and Wales. The lack of crowds has filtered in to television and has filtered in to people generally. Somebody called me today and said to me today, is the English match next weekend or the weekend after? Now, in 70 years, Nobody has ever said, when is
Yeah.
the England game? So
Yeah.
there is, and it's serious. I mean, I know I joke a lot with you, but it's very serious where this game lies at the moment in the home nations. Because like for so long, the richest rugby union in the world was Ireland. And that was primarily during the amateur era, obviously, where it husbanded its resources. It is now bust. The RFU is bust. If you had an accountant look at their accounts, he would declare them bust. But they're waiting for the government to give them money. Me, as a taxpayer, I'd be totally unhappy if the government gave money to a sport instead of giving it to people who are out of work.
It's good
But
thing you don't
this
live in New
isn't
Zealand.
over. This story is not over. I'm deeply concerned about the game. Deeply concerned.
Well, there's no doubt that this is a crippling event in our time, and it's, rugby is just part of it. It's crippling everything. And are we going to collectively all fall, or who's going to be left standing? It's yet to be seen. We've heard the echoes of vaccinations coming out and the implementation of it, but really, even if everybody was vaccinated tomorrow, we'd still have all of this to dig out from under. And Steve, you're front and center with being a GM with Rugby United New York and the Major League Rugby setup. You know about this more than anybody.
Look, there were stresses and strains in the professional game of rugby when you were allowed crowds. Okay, the thing was creaking, particularly the club game. Now, if we go into a further 6 nations without crowds, with those national unions of Scotland, Ireland, and Wales for sure are scuppered. England have their own issues. Those clubs in the Premiership won't sustain it. Australia are in trouble. South Africa aren't playing. I mean, wither the professional game, I think, is what George is saying, and one has to agree. It was already under stress. It could be unrecognizable in 12 months' time.
All right, so
less.
We're running out of time, but should they play the rest of these Autumn's Nations Cup matches with Fiji completely out of it with COVID?
Well, they have to. They've taken the money from Amazon. They'll play the games.
And how horrible is it that we finally get an Amazon involved in this, and this is what they have? But George, to your point about the crowds, this is actually an excuse for some setups where they had no crowds. South Africa, for instance, with their matches, they had nobody in the stands.
Look, this is very complicated, and I don't profess to have any answer to it. But for the first time in its history, the ruling bodies of the game, the 8 founder members of the International Rugby Board, the 5 home nations and the 3 Southern Hemisphere nations, are all effectively bust as a group. The game itself is struggling. I think it's possible that this game may survive, Ireland versus England or whatever. It then may survive with a kind of a Pro 14 of Leinster against the Dragons or whatever. But I can tell you from an Irish point of view, the bulwark of the game, which is our club rugby, and Steve will know about clubs like West of Scotland or Hawick or all Edinburgh Academicals or all these teams that were the bedrock of Scottish rugby and Irish rugby. And Scottish and Irish rugby are cousins. There's no question about that. If that game goes, you just can't have young fellas in some kind of a greenhouse and they don't play any rugby and then they come out and suddenly they play professional rugby. It won't work. This is as worrying now for the sport as it is for the economy. It's very worrying. And Steve knows because he said it. This was creaking before this. This is just maybe somebody's turning off the life support.
Well, here comes the ultimate optimist. I think it's a chance for a reset. We'll see what happens. I'm hoping I have no other choice but to feel that way and think that way. Final thoughts, Stephen.
There has to be. We have to hope for a positive future. So there's money in rugby, so you can upscale your wardrobe, because it's really looking a bit
I have my Team Corb shirt on.
Bit threadbare these days. Clean shirt. How about it?
Team Corpse. Okay.
Good cause. Good cause. We'll let you off with that one.
Thank you. Thank you. I didn't know that you were monitoring my wardrobe. I'll try to do a better job. George, aside from my wardrobe, final thoughts?
Sadly for me, I don't know. I am in a position where I really don't know. For all my certainty about many issues, where the game of rugby is at this moment in time in 2020, I have no idea. But unlike you, I am pessimistic rather than optimistic.
Wow, you guys are just more fun than a barrel of monkeys. Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? On that note, on behalf of Mr. George Hook calling in from Dublin, Mr. Steve Lewis calling in from the Upper West Side of Manhattan, I'm Matt McCarthy in Midtown Manhattan for Rugby Wrap Up, signing off. Go Pumas.